Cambridge, Massachusetts. December 1942. The fourth-floor laboratory of Harvard's Converse Memorial Building held secrets that would reshape modern warfare. Dr. Louis Frederick Fieser stood before a fume hood, watching a viscous gel drip from a glass stirring rod. The substance moved like honey, but ignited like gasoline. In his hands was chemistry the U.S. Army had explicitly forbidden him to create. Fieser wasn't a military man. At 43, the organic chemistry professor had spent his career synthesizing compounds for medicine and dyes. But Pearl Harbor had changed everything. The National Defense Research Committee had recruited him in early 1942 with a single desperate question. Could he make gasoline stick to targets long enough to burn them completely? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem facing American forces in the Pacific was brutally simple. Japanese defensive positions, carved into jungle hillsides and reinforced with logs and earth, couldn't be destroyed by conventional explosives. Artillery shells buried themselves in soft ground before detonating. Bombs penetrated jungle canopy and exploded harmlessly in vegetation. Infantry assaults against fortified positions produced casualty rates approaching 70%. Flame offered a solution, but only if it could reach inside fortifications and maintain burning temperatures long enough to consume oxygen and kill defenders. Standard gasoline burned too quickly. It splashed on impact, evaporated rapidly, and produced flames that lasted mere seconds. The army needed something that would cling to surfaces, burn intensely for extended periods, and could be delivered from aircraft or ground-based weapons. The British had experimented with flame warfare since 1940, developing crude thickening agents that turned gasoline into a gel. Their most successful formula used rubber dissolved in gasoline, creating a sticky substance they called PT1 for petroleum thickener number 1. It worked, but rubber was desperately scarce. Japanese forces controlled 90% of the world's natural rubber supply, and synthetic rubber production couldn't meet military demands for tires, gaskets, and countless other essential applications. Using precious rubber to make incendiary weapons seemed wasteful when American forces needed it for basic equipment. The War Production Board had explicitly prohibited rubber-based incendiaries in August 1942, directing researchers to find alternatives. Fieser received the directive on August 23rd, with a deadline that seemed impossible. Develop a rubber-free thickening agent within 60 days. The chemistry was more complex than simply finding a substitute. Whatever compound Fieser created had to meet exacting specifications. It needed to thicken gasoline to a consistency that wouldn't separate during storage or transport. It had to remain stable across temperature ranges from Arctic cold to tropical heat. The mixture had to ignite reliably and burn at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Most critically, it needed to be manufacturable using materials America possessed in abundance. Fieser's approach drew on years of organic chemistry research that seemed unrelated to weapons. He had spent the 1930s studying the molecular structures of steroids and vitamins, work that taught him how different molecular chains affected a substance's physical properties. Long-chain molecules created viscosity. Branching molecules affected how substances interacted with each other. The right combination might transform gasoline from liquid to gel without using rubber. His first attempts failed spectacularly. Mixing gasoline with various polymers available in American chemical plants produced substances that either wouldn't ignite, burned too, and quickly, or separated back into their components within hours. By late September 1942, Fieser had tested 47 different formulations without success. The breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. Naphthalene, a hydrocarbon derived from coal tar, had been used since the 1800s in mothballs and dye manufacturing. American industry produced naphthalene in massive quantities as a byproduct of steel production. Fieser wondered if naphthalene could be chemically modified to create long polymer chains similar to rubber's molecular structure. Working 18-hour days through October, Fieser and his research team, including graduate students and borrowed military chemists, synthesized aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids. These metallic soaps, when mixed with gasoline in precise ratios, caused the fuel to gel through a process called micellar structuring. The aluminum atoms bonded with the fatty acid chains, creating a three-dimensional, molecular network that trapped gasoline molecules in a thick, sticky matrix. The first successful batch emerged on October 26, 1942. Fieser mixed 6% aluminum naphthenate and 4% aluminum palmitate powder into 90 gallons of standard military gasoline. The resulting gel had the consistency of thick jam. It clung to vertical surfaces. It wouldn't evaporate. When ignited, it burned at temperatures approaching 1300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel. Fieser called the mixture napalm, combining syllables from naphthenic and palmitic acids. The name would become synonymous with modern warfare's most controversial weapon, but in late 1942, it was simply a solution to a tactical problem. Initial testing happened in Harvard's basement, where Fieser and his team built a makeshift proving ground. They constructed wooden frames representing Japanese bunker designs, gathered from military intelligence photographs. Small-scale napalm charges, 5 pounds each, were ignited against these targets. The results exceeded expectations. Napalm didn't just burn the wood, it adhered to surfaces, flowing into cracks and gaps, then ignited everything combustible. Temperatures inside the test bunkers reached 900 degrees Celsius within 30 seconds. Oxygen levels dropped to zero within 45 seconds. Any theoretical occupants would have died from heat, smoke inhalation, or oxygen deprivation long before the flames consumed the structure. The Army's Chemical Warfare Service, notified of Fieser's success in November, authorized immediate field testing. But scaling from laboratory batches to military quantities presented new challenges. The aluminum soaps required precise manufacturing. Temperature control during mixing was critical. Too hot, and the gasoline would ignite prematurely. Too cold, and the gel wouldn't form properly. Standard Oil of New Jersey received the contract to produce napalm. At industrial scale in December 1942, their engineers built specialized mixing facilities at refineries in New Jersey and California, using equipment that could blend 50-gallon batches under carefully controlled conditions. By January 1943, production reached 100,000 pounds monthly, packed in sealed drums that could be shipped directly to Pacific combat zones. The first operational use of napalm occurred not in the Pacific, but during testing in the Mojave Desert. On February 4, 1943, Army Air Forces engineers loaded napalm gel into modified fuel drop tanks attached to P-38 Lightning fighters. The plan was simple. Dive toward a target, release the tank, which would tumble toward the ground, then shatter on impact, spreading napalm that a phosphorus igniter would light. The first test drop failed completely. The fuel tank fell cleanly, hit the desert floor, bounced twice, and rolled intact down a sand dune. Engineers realized they needed a better delivery system. The solution came from an unlikely source. Automobile mechanic turned ordnance officer Lieutenant Paul Morrison suggested adding quick-fuse explosives to the nose of each drop tank. Upon impact, a small bursting charge would rupture the tank and disperse the napalm gel an instant before phosphorus igniters set it ablaze. Modified tanks tested on February 18th worked perfectly. The napalm spread across a 200-foot radius and burned for 8 minutes, creating a firestorm that consumed every bit of vegetation in the target zone. Temperatures at ground level exceeded 1,000 degrees. Sand fused into glass at the impact point. The Chemical Warfare Service immediately ordered 5,000 napalm bombs for Pacific deployment, but Fieser's creation had awakened concerns among military lawyers and strategists. Flame weapons occupied ambiguous legal territory. The 1907 Hague Convention prohibited weapons that caused unnecessary suffering, though unnecessary remained undefined. Flamethrowers had been used extensively in World War I without international condemnation, but aerial delivery of incendiaries against ground targets was newer and potentially more controversial. Army lawyers reviewing napalm deployment in March 1943 concluded the weapon was legal under existing international law, provided it targeted military objectives rather than civilian populations. The distinction would prove increasingly difficult to maintain as the war progressed, but in early 1943, napalm was approved for combat use against Japanese military fortifications. The weapon's first combat test came in the summer of 1943 during Allied operations against Japanese positions on New Georgia Island in the Solomon Chain. Intelligence reports described heavily fortified bunkers built into hillsides, connected by tunnels, and protected by interlocking fields of fire. Previous assaults had failed with devastating losses. 4th Marine Division infantry units had suffered 43% casualties attempting to take a single ridgeline. On July 21, 1943, 12 P-38 Lightnings from the 13th Air Force loaded napalm bombs at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Each aircraft carried 2 150-gallon drop tanks filled with Fieser's gel. The mission briefing was straightforward. Strike Japanese positions on the Munda Point Peninsula with incendiaries, followed by immediate infantry assault while defenders were disoriented. The attack began at 0600 hours. P-38 seconds approached at 3,000 feet, rolled into 45-degree dives, and released their napalm tanks at 1,000 feet. The physics of the drop meant bombs would impact with substantial velocity, ensuring complete dispersal of the gel before ignition. Staff Sergeant James Holt, a forward observer with the 43rd Infantry Division, recorded his observations in an after-action report filed 3 days later. His account provides the first detailed combat assessment of napalm's effects. The drop tanks hit just forward of the Japanese trench line at 0603. The explosion wasn't loud, more of a soft whump sound. Then the fire spread so fast I couldn't track it. 1 second there was jungle. The next second a wall of flame maybe 40 feet high covered everything. The heat reached our position 200 yards away. We could feel it on our faces like standing too close to a blast furnace. What Holt witnessed was napalm's unique combustion characteristics. Unlike gasoline fires that burn upward, consuming fuel as they rise, napalm gel adhered to surfaces and burned laterally, flowing like liquid fire across the target area. The aluminum soaps in Fieser's formula also contributed to the intense heat. When aluminum burned, it released additional energy, pushing temperatures beyond what hydrocarbon combustion alone could achieve. Japanese defenders in the target zone faced multiple simultaneous threats. The initial blast wave from tank rupture created overpressure that stunned anyone in proximity. Napalm gel splashed into trenches, bunkers, and tunnels, igniting everything combustible. The intense heat rapidly consumed oxygen, creating a vacuum effect that pulled air from surrounding areas. Defenders who survived the initial flames often suffocated as oxygen levels dropped to zero within enclosed spaces. Holt's report continued. The infantry assault started at 06:15, 12 minutes after the napalm strike. We expected resistance. We got nothing. The Japanese positions were completely silent. When we reached the trench line, we found maybe 40 bodies. None showed burns. They looked like they were sleeping, but their skin was bright red from heat exposure. The medical officer said they'd suffocated when the fire consumed all the oxygen. The tactical results from Munda Point exceeded Army expectations. A defensive position that had withstood 2 weeks of artillery bombardment and cost 200 American casualties in failed assaults fell in 18 minutes, with 0 attacking casualties. The napalm hadn't just defeated the defences, it had eliminated them so completely that infantry faced no resistance. Chemical Warfare Service analysts studying the Munda Point strike identified key advantages napalm offered over conventional weapons. Artillery could destroy above-ground structures but couldn't reach troops in bunkers or tunnels. Napalm flowed into protective spaces, turning cover into death traps. High explosives could be evaded by trained soldiers who took cover during bombardment. Napalm's sustained burning gave defenders nowhere to hide. Conventional attacks required infantry to assault fortified positions directly. Napalm cleared positions before infantry arrived, reducing friendly casualties dramatically. By August 1943, napalm production increased to £500,000 monthly. The Chemical Warfare Service established standardized delivery systems. M69 incendiary cluster bombs, containing 47 individual napalm bomblets, could blanket large areas. M47 napalm bombs, essentially modified fuel tanks holding 100 gallons of gel, provided precision strikes against specific targets. Man-portable napalm charges, 50-pound drums with timed fuses, gave infantry units the ability to employ flame weapons without aircraft support. But napalm's effectiveness raised troubling questions that Fieser himself grappled with during late 1943. In a letter to his wife Mary, dated September 17th, he wrote, "We've created something that works too well. The reports from the Pacific describe effects that disturb me. I set out to solve a chemistry problem. I didn't fully consider what solving that problem would mean for the men on the receiving end. War requires terrible weapons, but I wonder if we've exceeded what's necessary." Fieser's ethical concerns weren't unique among weapons developers, but they were rarely voiced openly. The Manhattan Project scientists working on atomic weapons would face similar dilemmas 2 years later. The moral weight of creating instruments of mass destruction fell heavily on men trained to use science for human benefit, not destruction. The strategic calculus, however, favored napalm deployment. American military planners in late 1943 faced a brutal reality. Defeating Japan would require taking hundreds of fortified islands across the Pacific. Each assault promised horrific casualties unless new weapons could reduce the cost. Napalm offered a way to neutralize defenses without prolonged bombardment or costly infantry assaults. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, received briefings on napalm effectiveness in October 1943. His response, recorded in meeting minutes, reflected the pragmatic view prevailing among senior commanders. This incendiary compound reduces casualties among our forces while defeating enemy positions. I see no reason to limit its employment. The Japanese have shown no reluctance to use whatever weapons achieve their objectives. We should demonstrate similar resolve. Production accelerated through winter 1943 to 1944. By March 1944, monthly napalm output reached £2 million. New manufacturing facilities opened in Texas and Louisiana, using petroleum industry infrastructure to mix the aluminum soaps with refined gasoline. The logistical pipeline moved finished napalm from Gulf Coast ports to Pacific staging areas in Hawaii, reaching forward bases in the Marshalls and Marianas within 3 weeks of production. Tactical employment evolved as commanders learned napalm's capabilities and limitations. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against wooden structures, vegetation, and troops in the open. It was less useful against reinforced concrete bunkers or steel fortifications, though the heat could still kill occupants through oxygen deprivation. Optimal delivery required accurate targeting. Napalm dropped too far from intended positions, simply burned jungle without tactical effect. By spring 1944, Fieser's creation had become standard ordnance throughout Pacific air and ground forces. What began as a forbidden chemistry experiment in a Harvard laboratory had transformed into one of the war's most widely used weapons. The aluminum soap formula that violated rubber use prohibitions was now manufactured at industrial scale, shipped across oceans, and employed in combat operations from the Solomons to the Philippines. The true test of napalm's capabilities, however, still lay ahead. On a small island called Tinian, in July 1944, American forces would employ Fieser's gel in quantities, and with effects that would demonstrate both the weapon's terrible power and the profound moral questions it raised about the nature of modern warfare. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas, July 24, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness concealed nearly 200 aircraft assembling over the Philippine Sea. Aboard 47 B-25 Mitchell bombers, crews performed final checks on a cargo that would introduce industrial-scale flame warfare to the Pacific campaign. Each bomber carried 20 M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Inside every cluster, 47 individual bomblets contained 6 pounds of napalm gel mixed with white phosphorus. The mathematical calculus was straightforward. 47 aircraft, 20 clusters each, 47 bomblets per cluster equals 44,192 individual incendiary devices, totaling over 265,000 pounds of Fieser's aluminum-thickened gasoline. This single strike would deliver more napalm than all previous Pacific operations combined. The target was Tinian Town, the island's administrative centre, where Japanese commanders had concentrated nearly 8,000 troops in prepared defensive positions. Intelligence photographs showed the town's layout: wooden barracks arranged in military precision, ammunition storage facilities, headquarters buildings, and interconnected trench systems. Every structure was combustible. American planners intended to exploit that vulnerability. The decision to use napalm on this scale represented a significant escalation in Pacific air warfare doctrine. Previous strikes had targeted specific military positions: bunkers, gun emplacements, supply dumps. The Tinian raid would attack an entire military garrison simultaneously, creating what chemical warfare service planners called a flame zone, where sustained burning would deny the area to enemy forces for extended periods. Major General Willis Hale, commanding 7th Air Force, approved the operation with full awareness of its implications. His briefing to bomber crews on July 23rd included unusually frank language. "Tomorrow, you'll deliver more incendiary tonnage than any previous mission in this theatre. The objective is to destroy enemy combat capability through maximum application of flame. This will be unpleasant. It's also necessary. The invasion of Tinian begins in 48 hours. Every Japanese soldier killed by fire tomorrow is one who won't be shooting at Marines on the beach." The first bombers reached Tinian at 05:45 hours, July 24th. Japanese radar detected the formation, but darkness prevented accurate anti-aircraft fire. Bombardiers activated their northern bomb sites, inputting coordinates that would space cluster bombs across a grid pattern covering Tinian Town's 2-square-mile area. At 05:52, the lead aircraft released its first cluster from 8,000 feet. The cluster tumbled through darkness, streamers trailing to stabilize its descent. At 1,000 feet, a barometric fuse triggered an explosive charge that burst the cluster casing, scattering 47 napalm bomblets across a 100-meter radius. Each bomblet was engineered for maximum incendiary effect. The casing was thin metal designed to rupture on ground impact. Inside, 6 pounds of napalm gel surrounded a white phosphorus igniter charge. Upon hitting the ground, the bomblet case split open, splashing napalm gel outward. A half-second later, the phosphorus igniter activated, producing temperatures hot enough to instantly ignite the gasoline-based gel. What happened next was visible from ships 20 miles offshore. The first cluster's 47 bomblets created 47 individual fires that merged within seconds into a single conflagration. As subsequent aircraft dropped their loads, the fires multiplied geometrically. Within 3 minutes, over 6,000 individual ignition points had created a firestorm covering most of Tinian Town. The physics of what occurred involved more than simple combustion. When thousands of separate fires burn simultaneously in a confined area, they consume oxygen faster than ambient air can replace it. This creates a pressure differential that pulls air inward from surrounding areas. As fresh oxygen rushes toward the flames, it heats to ignition temperature from radiant heat, creating secondary fires beyond the original impact zone. The incoming air creates winds that fan the flames to even greater intensity, producing a self-sustaining cycle that generates hurricane-force winds and temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Meteorologists studying post-raid reconnaissance photographs identified classic firestorm characteristics. The smoke column rose to 18,000 feet, visible for 100 miles. Surface wind speeds within the burn zone exceeded 70 miles per hour, generated entirely by the fire's heat. The flames consumed every combustible material within the impact area, including underground wooden supports in trench systems and bunkers. Sergeant William Bradford, a Marine Corps intelligence analyst aboard the USS Pennsylvania offshore, observed the strike through binoculars. His report, filed the following day, provided a ground-level perspective. At 0600, the entire northern portion of the island appeared to be burning. We could see individual fires merging into larger ones. The smoke was black and dense, rising straight up initially, then spreading outward at about 15,000 feet. By 0615, the flames were creating their own weather system. We observed lightning in the smoke column, generated by static electricity from superheated gases. The heat was so intense that coconut trees outside the impact zone spontaneously ignited from radiation alone. The Japanese garrison's response, or lack thereof, demonstrated napalm's psychological impact. Radio intercepts captured by Marine Corps Signals Intelligence documented the breakdown of command authority. At 0600 hours, just as the strike began, Japanese commanders transmitted standard contact reports. By 0610, messages became fragmented and panicked. At 0620, all radio traffic ceased. Post-battle interrogation of the few Japanese survivors provided fragmentary accounts of what happened inside the firestorm. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda, captured 3 days after the invasion, described his experience. "I was in a concrete bunker when the bombing started. We heard the aircraft but saw nothing in the darkness. Then the world turned orange. Through the observation port I saw fire everywhere, moving like a living thing. It flowed uphill, around buildings, into trenches. Men in open positions were engulfed instantly. Those in bunkers tried to seal themselves inside, but the fire consumed the oxygen. We could feel the heat through concrete walls. The air became too hot to breathe. Men suffocated with their gas masks on, because the incoming air was above boiling temperature." The casualty assessment from the July 24th strike remains approximate because many bodies were consumed entirely in the flames. Marine Corps intelligence estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers died directly from the incendiary attack, with another 1,000 incapacitated by burns, smoke inhalation, or heat injuries. Tinian town itself ceased to exist as a functional military position. Every wooden structure burned completely. Equipment not destroyed by fire was damaged by extreme heat. Ammunition stocks detonated sympathetically, creating secondary explosions that continued for 6 hours after the raid ended. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Tinian's northwest beaches on July 24th, just hours after the napalm strike. Their initial advance encountered virtually no resistance from the town garrison that had been expected to provide reinforcements. Japanese forces capable of fighting had been drawn from other positions, but the planned counterattack from Tinian town never materialized because the attacking units no longer existed. Marine casualties during the first 48 hours of the Tinian invasion totaled 156, killed and 843 wounded, dramatically lower than predicted losses. Planners had estimated first-day casualties might reach 20% of assault forces, approximately 3,000 men, based on experiences at Tarawa and Saipan. The napalm strike's elimination of Tinian town's garrison contributed directly to the reduced casualty figures. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. From a purely military perspective, the Tinian napalm raid represented successful application of overwhelming force. At a cost of 0 American casualties and 265,000 pounds of incendiary material, the strike eliminated roughly 40% of Japanese combat power on the island before Marines went ashore. The arithmetic favored such tactics: exchange material for lives, use American industrial capacity to reduce American casualty lists. But the operation also marked a threshold. The scale of destruction, the industrial application of flame warfare, and the deliberate creation of firestorm conditions represented warfare methods that troubled even those who advocated their use. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, toured Tinian town's remains on July 28th. His diary entry that evening reflected ambivalence. "Walked through the burn zone today. Nothing remains but ash and twisted metal. The smell is indescribable. This is victory, but a victory that leaves me uneasy. We've learned to deliver destruction with terrible efficiency. I wonder if there are moral costs we're not yet calculating. The Tinian operation established napalm as standard doctrine for Pacific Island assaults. Similar strikes preceded landings at Peleliu in September 1944, Iwo Jima in February 1945, and Okinawa in April 1945. Each operation refined delivery techniques and increased tonnage. By spring 1945, B-29 superfortresses were dropping napalm on Japanese home islands, with single raids delivering over 2,000 tons of incendiaries against urban targets. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan raised questions that military effectiveness calculations couldn't easily answer. When napalm targeted military garrisons on remote Pacific islands, the moral arithmetic remained relatively straightforward. Defeat enemy forces while minimizing friendly casualties. When the same weapons targeted Japanese cities where military production facilities were interspersed with civilian housing, the calculations became infinitely more complex. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 10, 1945, employed napalm-based incendiaries that killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night. Similar raids struck Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities through summer 1945. The weapon Fieser created to solve a tactical problem had scaled to strategic application with consequences he never imagined in his Harvard laboratory. Fieser's own relationship with his creation grew increasingly troubled. In a November 1944 letter to the National Defense Research Committee, he wrote, "I receive regular reports on napalm employment in theatre. The tactical results vindicate the chemistry, but I find myself disturbed by the scale and the targets. I created napalm to defeat fortified positions. I'm now told it's being considered for use against urban areas. This exceeds what I believed was intended. I cannot protest orders from military commanders, but I can state clearly that such applications go beyond anything I advocated or envisioned." His concerns received polite acknowledgement, but no policy changes. By late 1944, napalm production had become too valuable to the war effort to reconsider based on one chemist's ethical reservations. Monthly production exceeded £5 million. Supply lines delivered the gel to every forward base in the Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of troops had trained in napalm employment. The weapon had become integral to American military strategy. The end of World War II in August 1945 didn't end napalm's military career. The weapon saw extensive use in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where it proved as effective against Chinese and North Korean fortifications as it had been against Japanese positions. Vietnam brought napalm into the television age, where images of burning villages and injured civilians created public opposition that Fieser's wartime work had never generated. Louis Fieser continued teaching at Harvard until his retirement in 1968. He published extensively on organic chemistry, trained generations of students, and contributed to pharmaceutical research that developed important medicines. But his legacy remained inseparably linked to the weapon he created in 1942. In a 1967 interview, conducted as anti-war protests swept American universities, Fieser reflected on napalm with the perspective of 25 years. "I'm asked frequently if I regret creating napalm. The honest answer is complicated. In wartime, I believed I was helping end the conflict more quickly and save American lives. Those calculations proved accurate. The war ended sooner because of weapons like napalm, and many soldiers came home who might not have otherwise. But I didn't foresee the long-term applications. I didn't imagine the weapon would be used for decades after the war ended, in conflicts I don't understand and don't support. If I could go back to 1942 with present knowledge, would I make the same choices? I genuinely don't know." His uncertainty reflected a broader question facing scientists whose work contributes to military technology. The knowledge itself is morally neutral. Chemistry doesn't have ethics, but the application of knowledge creates moral consequences that researchers can't always predict or control. Fieser set out to solve a specific problem, making gasoline adhere to targets. His solution worked brilliantly. The fact that his solution could be scaled from tactical weapon to strategic instrument of mass destruction wasn't something chemistry could answer. The Japanese perspective on napalm, documented through post-war interviews and historical research, emphasized the weapon's psychological impact. Colonel Takashi Nishiura, who survived multiple napalm attacks during the Philippines campaign, described the experience in a 1952 memoir. "We trained to endure artillery, to take cover from bombs, to face rifle fire with courage. Nothing prepared us for napalm. Fire is a primal fear. When it falls from the sky and pursues you like a living enemy, courage becomes meaningless. You can't shoot fire. You can't hide from it. You can only run or die." The Americans understood this. They used our fear as a weapon as much as the flames themselves. His assessment identified napalm's fundamental effectiveness. Traditional weapons could be endured by disciplined troops using proper cover and tactics. Napalm removed the possibility of endurance. It didn't give defenders the option to stand firm. It forced retreat or death, and retreat often led to death anyway, as the flames spread faster than men could run. The tactical innovation that Fieser's chemistry enabled influenced warfare beyond World War II's Pacific theater. Soviet forces developed their own napalm variants after capturing German documentation of American weapons. NATO standardized napalm delivery systems during the Cold War. Middle Eastern conflicts from 1967 onward saw widespread incendiary warfare. The basic concept, aluminum soaps mixed with gasoline to create persistent flame, became universal military technology. Modern napalm successors use different chemistry but employ the same principles. Thermite-based weapons create even higher temperatures. Fuel-air explosives extend the area of effect beyond what simple burning can achieve. White phosphorus, often mixed with napalm in World War II, remains in arsenals worldwide. The fundamental insight that Fieser demonstrated that controlled chemistry can transform ordinary fuel into a devastatingly effective weapon continues to drive military research. The human cost of that innovation remains difficult to calculate. Japanese casualties from napalm throughout the Pacific campaign exceeded 50,000 military personnel. Strategic bombing with napalm-based incendiaries killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Korean War napalm casualties included both military and civilian victims in numbers that remain disputed. Vietnam-era napalm injured approximately 400,000 people, many of them civilians. The iconic photograph of 9-year-old Phan Thi Kim Phuc running from a napalm attack in 1972 became one of the war's defining images, illustrating how a tactical weapon could create humanitarian catastrophes when employed without precision. International law eventually addressed incendiary weapons, though not until long after Fieser's death in 1979. The United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, includes Protocol 3, restricting incendiary weapons use against civilian populations. The protocol doesn't ban napalm outright, but limits its employment to clearly military objectives. Enforcement remains challenging, as modern conflicts rarely observe such distinctions. Louis Fieser died on July 19, 1979, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at age 79. Obituaries emphasized his contributions to chemistry and medicine, mentioning his anti-malarial drug research and his influential organic chemistry textbook that trained thousands of students. Napalm appeared in most accounts, but often as a single paragraph in lives that spanned decades of scientific achievement. His family's statement at his death included a passage that revealed his complicated legacy. Louis believed deeply in science's potential to benefit humanity. He contributed to medicine, to education, and yes, to military technology during wartime. He understood that his wartime work carried moral weight, and he thought seriously about those implications throughout his life. He didn't seek to justify or apologize for napalm. He simply acknowledged it as part of history, something that happened because circumstances demanded solutions and chemistry provided them. The laboratory at Harvard, where Fieser developed napalm, no longer exists. Converse Memorial building was demolished in 1973 to make room for modern facilities. No plaque marks where the mixing experiments occurred. The university's archives hold Fieser's papers, including his wartime notebooks, but they're rarely accessed except by specialized researchers. The last major American use of napalm occurred during the 1991 Gulf War, where Marine Corps aircraft dropped napalm on Iraqi positions in Kuwait. Subsequent conflicts have seen limited employment, as precision-guided munitions and thermobaric weapons offer similar effects with less political controversy. Modern military forces possess the capability to produce and deploy napalm, but rarely choose to do so, reflecting changed warfare norms and increased sensitivity to weapons that cause particularly horrific injuries. The legacy of Fieser's creation extends beyond the weapon itself to questions about scientific responsibility that remain unresolved. When researchers develop technology at a government's request during wartime, how much control do they retain over that technology's ultimate use? Should scientists consider potential misuse when creating new capabilities? Can knowledge be undiscovered if its applications prove too dangerous? Fieser himself never claimed to have answers. In his final published reflection on napalm, written in 1978, he offered only questions. Science provides capabilities. Society chooses how to employ them. I provided a capability. Society employed it in ways that achieved military objectives at terrible human cost. Could different choices have been made? Certainly. But those weren't my choices to make. I was a chemist asked to solve a problem. I solved it. Whether that solution should have been used as extensively as it was, in the circumstances it was, against the targets it was, those questions belong to historians, ethicists, and the soldiers who carried out the orders. I can only say I did what I believed was right, at the time, with the information I had, facing circumstances that seemed to demand action. His uncertainty, the admission that even decades later he couldn't definitively judge his own wartime work, stands as perhaps the most honest assessment any weapons developer has offered. The comfortable narratives that paint such decisions as clearly right or obviously wrong don't withstand scrutiny. Fieser created something that saved American lives and ended enemy lives with particular cruelty. Both facts remain true simultaneously. The small Harvard laboratory where napalm began continues through the students it trained and the chemistry it demonstrated. Fieser's textbooks remain in print, teaching organic chemistry to new generations who may never learn their author developed one of warfare's most controversial weapons. The knowledge he uncovered about aluminum soaps and hydrocarbon gelling has civilian applications in adhesives and sealants. The same molecular principles that made napalm cling to targets help modern materials bind to surfaces in construction and manufacturing. Perhaps that represents the fundamental truth about technology. It has no inherent morality. The knowledge of how to thicken gasoline with metallic soaps can create weapons or building materials. The chemistry remains neutral, only its application carries moral weight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.